Welcome to the third feedback loop for the Wagga co-design. We're here today to present you some of the information we've gathered in the combined session and in some of the surveys. My name's Tina and I do a range of things for Roses in the Ocean, but mostly focused on helping to develop services for the SP peer workforce. Carrie?
Hi everyone, I'm Carrie. I do some facilitation with Roses, particularly around the co-design of new services. Great to be here.
So I'm just going to share the slides that we have with you now. Sorry. So we'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which the safe space is going to be set up. So because this is an online session, we're located on a range of different lands, but we'd in particular like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people who are the traditional owners or traditional custodians of the land where the safe space will be set up in Wagga. We'd also like to acknowledge Wiradjuri elders, past and present, as well as the young Wiradjuri will be the elders of the future. Also, we'd like to acknowledge the leading role that Aboriginal communities have played in new approaches to suicide prevention. It's also important that we acknowledge the role that lived experience and the expertise that lived experiences have brought to this co-design process. And it's important that we understand that this is not just people who have a lived experience of experiencing a suicidal crisis themselves, but also people who have a lived experience of supporting someone or have been bereaved through suicide. And that a lot of health professionals involved in the process also have their own personal lived experience and have that personal experience too of being impacted through their work by being impacted on by suicide. So we've been through quite a process in Wagga with, and it's a process that has involved both people of lived experience of suicide and health professionals. We started off by having some what we call focus conversations. So bringing together small groups of people of lived experience and small groups of people who are health professionals and having really focused conversations around what the experience is like for people who are currently accessing help during a suicidal crisis through the emergency department. We then brought together larger groups of people with lived experience and larger groups of health professionals to have a much broader conversation around the needs that need to be met in these safe spaces and how those needs might be met, and in particular with health professionals, what they need in order to feel comfortable supporting people to access the safe space as an alternative to the emergency department. At the end of those sessions, we had what we call feedback loops, which you're involved in one of these now. And that's where we feed back to everyone in the Wagga region what's come out of these conversations and provide a link to a survey so that everyone in that community and in that LHD can provide their perspective on what they would like to see happening with the safe spaces that are being set up. And we then had a combined session. At that combined session, we presented a group that involved both people of lived experience and health professionals coming together. And we presented what come out of these feedback loops and the responses to surveys, and had some conversations around some of the more complex or more difficult issues that involve a range of different perspectives around how we're going to set up a safe space in the Wagga region that meets the needs of everyone. So what we're here to do today is we're here to present to everyone in the Wagga area the information that came out of those combined session conversations. So the perspectives that were shared by people who have lived experience and by health professionals when they were talking together about a range of scenarios that raise some of the issues that have come up in the process and the conversations we've been having with people in Wagga. So the purpose of today is to tell you what came out of those conversations, but also to give people in the area the opportunity to have their perspective represented in the process by responding to questions in a survey that we'll give you a link to at the end. So what I'm going to share with you now are the responses we got in the surveys from the second feedback loop that we had for the Wagga area. So that involved 4 people responding to the survey who had a lived experience perspective, and it also involved 7 health professionals who responded to that survey. So we'll start with the lived experience perspectives that came out of that survey. The respondents in the survey who had lived experience said that they mostly agreed with the findings that were presented in the outcomes of the process so far. One respondent suggested that a great location for the service in Wagga would be between the Centrelink on Thompson Street and the hospital. They pointed out that that particular area is really well connected with public transport. One of the respondents did strongly disagree with one of the statements, and that was a statement that had come out of the conversations with people who have lived experience, where the views that were shared in that conversation were that it should be a space specifically for people who are experiencing a suicidal crisis, rather than a space for carers or loved ones to obtain support. It was felt that people who came to the safe space as a carer or as a family member or a loved one of someone in an experiencing a suicidal crisis, that those people should be connected up with support elsewhere. So this particular person made it clear in their response to the survey that they felt that carers and support people should be able to obtain support and should be able to debrief in the safe space. They should be able to get information on how to move forward, even if they're not offered long-term support in the safe space. Another respondent disagreed with the statement that the safe space should have oversight from people with lived experience who value non-medical interventions. This person felt that the reference to non-medical interventions was not appropriate. So we don't have any other information statement, but it'd be really good if we could get some perspectives around that in people's responses to the survey. What you see on the right here are some quotes, and you're welcome to, at any stage, to pause if you're watching this as a recorded webinar, to pause the webinar and read through all of the quotes that we're presenting you. So we'll just present some of the ones that I guess we see as being particularly relevant to some of the conversations that have come out in the Wagga area. So one person commented that they were not sure that day groups would be best located in the safe space, that it'd be great to have these, but they'd prefer the space to be more private. So I guess they're saying, rather than entering the space and finding groups running, it'd be good if it were a private space for people experiencing suicidal crisis. To only have people there that are in need of immediate support rather than regular visitors for programs. These are just some other quotes from the survey after the second feedback loop. So it was great to have somebody tell us that they said, I think this process is incredible. So it's really good to get some positive feedback around the co-design process. Another person commented, I also place emphasis on when we're connecting people with services, that people being there for introductions as much as possible. That would be incredible, not just people being sent away with an address. So I believe that's a reference to what's often referred to as a warm handover, the idea that often people connect better with other services if somebody is actually with them to support them during that connection process. Another person commented that they were not sure that funding or staffing will allow for all these things to be provided. And that's actually something that's been echoed quite a bit through these final stages of the co-design process in Wagga. Concerns that people have some great ideas, but people who are involved in the co-design are not really sure how that's going to be achievable within the staffing of 2 full-time SPP workers and the funding that's being provided to the safe space. Another person commented that all people who will be working there will need to undertake some form of training to ensure they understand the diversity of conditions people may present with and how to best communicate with and support them. Having a lived experience alone is not sufficient to be able to work as a support worker in this setting. And again, it was interesting that that survey comment really reflects some of the conversations that we've been having throughout this process about the diversity of needs in Wagga. And that covers both cultural needs and also the needs of people who are experiencing other things as well, such as it's been raised that a lot of people who have autism, that when people with autism access the space, so that the workers need to be trained to be able to meet their needs as well. So now I'm going to present you the findings that we have, or the feedback that we received from the 7 health professionals who responded to the survey. So health professionals either strongly agreed or agreed with the information that was captured in the process so far. They identified a number of important things to consider in terms of the location of the safe space, and that includes access, environment, safety, and the response of the community or residents nearby to the location of the safe space. There are a number of concerns and uncertainties that were raised in these surveys that we received. These include issues of legislative responsibilities, so concerns about how the safe space would meet responsibilities under the Mental Health Act. It was raised, for instance, that smoking is not allowed on the grounds of New South Wales Health Services. However, people with lived experience have raised the fact that they would like there to be a smoking area in the safe space. So there were just concerns about that. There was also concern about the replication of existing mental health services, and that this should actually be a genuine alternative and not just a replication of services that are already available. Health professionals were concerned about the exclusion of carers and family members from the safe space. They also would like more clarity around the scope and purpose of the safe space, and they're concerned that there needs to be alignment with existing LHD governance and oversight. There was emphasis in the surveys that the safe space is complementary to current services and should enhance options and accessibility, and that they're also, those of you that have watched previous webinars will be familiar with the way that we present information that's come out of the process, that some of it is put in red and described as out of scope for this co-design process, either because it's inconsistent with the Ministry of Health guidelines or because it's not something that can be achieved within the safe space. And so it was commented that these comments that are out of scope really need to be fed back to community mental health services for consideration, so that these comments can be used to improve other services in the region. So again, we've got some quotes here from health professionals in the survey. I'm just like to point out a few of them. So one person commented that it's important that carers and family members are not excluded, especially when they are concerned and distressed. Another person commented that it's important for clear boundaries and for there to be an understanding of role. So there needs to be an understanding that the safe space is there for support and not treatment. Here are some more comments from health professionals. Just want to point out a few of them. So you can see up the top here on the right that the number and accessibility of rooms may pose a security risk. So I think that that's a reference to the fact that there have been requests for private spaces. In particular, that's come up in the conversations with people who have lived experience. And this person is commenting that that may create security risks within the space. Also that in our services, we need to be cognizant of the Mental Health Act, which is for care and protection of people who may be at risk of harm to self. And that sometimes these people don't want to go to hospital when this is the only place that can provide a level of safety. Another person commented that, like an emergency department, the safe space should link people to the appropriate service, not take the place of those services. If current services need changes, then that should occur. I think we need to have some clarity around the difference between a safe haven drop-in and treatments. This is complementary to current services and should enhance options available. I also need to highlight that there was a comment that there's a need for input from Aboriginal and other cultural groups. So the cultural diversity of Wagga, and in particular the needs of Aboriginal people in the Wagga area, is something that has come up repeatedly throughout our conversations, and this person is pointing out that this really needs input from a wide range of cultural groups and from Aboriginal people. So I'm going to hand over to Carrie now, who will fill you in on what happened in the conversations that we had during the combined session that brought together people of lived experience and health professionals in the Wagga area.
Thanks, Tina. So really the meaty part of the conversation in that final joint co-design session was around how to test out some quite complex, potentially complex scenarios that may happen in practice once the safe space set up, and to really test how the local safe space will work with guests in those scenarios in alignment with the values and principles that have been identified by the local lived experience participants that are important to them, but also obviously in alignment with the ministry requirements, particularly around the idea that this is a non-clinical service and a non-clinical service where clinical services won't be provided. Thanks, Tina. So the first scenario is Chantal is a 17-year-old teenage girl who arrives at the safe space experiencing suicidal thoughts. It's the first time she has ever reached out for help, and she's frightened by what she's experiencing. She doesn't know where else to go. It's 8 p.m, just 30 minutes before closing time. So the broad purpose of that scenario is, how does the safe space work with someone who is a young person? So technically these spaces are likely to be 18 plus. And then also, how does the safe space, and in particular the SP peer workers, work with people effectively when they turn up at the end of opening hours? Thanks, Tina. So in terms of how lived experience, people with lived experience and health professionals responded to this, here are some of the suggestions in the approach. The level of risk due to Chantal being 17 years old and potentially vulnerable needs to be considered. So that was just a general point that people agreed about, particularly the idea of her being a particularly vulnerable person potentially. There was conversations around a focus on referring to appropriate services available within business hours, but an appreciation that in these out of hours that there already are existing services. So it's about sort of what are the partnerships and connections to those. There was also a big focus on, from both health professionals and people with lived experience, developing safety plans, including taking into consideration those in hours and out of hours strategies and linking with natural support. So people said taking that kind of strength-based approach around what is already working, are there coping strategies that can be identified with the person, and also what are their natural supports, and could they be harnessed in any meaningful way? And then focusing, I've said, as again on engaging natural supports, but also not telling her. So this speaks to the approach that regardless of the nature of that support, not telling her what to do, but providing Chantal with options and taking that empowered approach. So again, that idea that it needs to be consistent with the ministry requirements, and with the values and principles that were drafted by the local lived experience participants. There was also a suggestion there just needs to be flexible closing time, protocols around overtime, for example, time in lieu beyond the official closing time. Important that the model doesn't shut people out. So there was a comment from a health professional saying in their own service, while they have business hours, that there's just it's always about need, the person putting the person's need at the centre rather than just organisational need. And then exploring options with a warm line or another type of callback service to follow up in the after hours or the next day. Thanks, Tina. Then scenario 2 was Leanne walks into the safe space. She knows the safe space well, having visited for a few weeks in a row. She had previously told an SP peer worker it is a place where she can relax for a while, knowing she's safe from self-harming while there. Tonight, she appears to be intoxicated and is quite agitated that the peer worker who she now feels she can trust isn't available to talk with her. She's becoming quite loud and insistent, and another guest has indicated that it's making them uncomfortable. So as you can probably see, the purpose of this is around what is the approach, what's the response, if it's any different of an SP peer worker to someone who may appear to be intoxicated, and also that thing of how does a safe space successfully manage sometimes the competing needs of guests. Thanks, Tina. So here was the way that health professionals and lived experience people worked through this scenario and some of the suggested sort of responses and solutions to it. So first just comment, and it was something that was really emphasised by both people with lived experience and health professionals, that staff will need a lot of meaningful support. So that speaks to the fact that the SP peer workforce is going to be provided with a range of support services. And then the no wrong door approach is always should be seen as a guiding principle and upheld regardless of the scenario, was something that people did make clear that was important. Someone said that rules, however, need to be established for people who are aggressive or violent. So there was discussion around that, the idea that there needed to be clear protocols. Staff being skilled in having conversation around identifying people's needs. So again, that's the idea of the staff being trained and supported and having some experience and skill around those person-centered conversations. Clearly defined boundaries need to be established around what should be expected by staff and visitors. So again, those idea of very clearly articulated protocols. And then someone suggested the rule is if a person can engage with the service, even if mildly intoxicated, they shouldn't be excluded. Behaviour is the defining factor rather than trying to assess people for intoxication, which in the room people acknowledge is an impossible thing anyway, because it often relies on self-reporting. But it's not so much about the assessment and excluding people on the face of it because of intoxication, but more how does that intoxication express itself and the impact of it on staff and other guests. Consideration, people said, should also be given to people who may have experienced previous trauma, and that was both from the perspective of a guest like Leanne, but also the other guests. And that speaks to this idea of balancing the needs of existing guests with newly arrived guests who may be aggressive or intoxicated. Again, this idea that there needs to be a plan put in place for where and why to send people elsewhere. So again, that speaks to the idea there needs to be clearly defined protocols for SP peer workers. Thanks, Tina. If we just go back to the previous slide, I think. Yeah, so there's some more stuff. We really got pretty rich conversation around this scenario. Some of this is probably a little repetitive. I'm just having a look. Again, engage in a conversation regarding what services Leanne already engages with and what else may be of value. So again, taking that sort of more, I guess, person-centered and strengths-based approach. Again, people during this conversation wanted to emphasise the alignment with the ministry requirements. So risk tolerance, it's very important to honour this value. Leanne has reached out for a reason and is seeking support. Taking the approach that validation and unconditional positive regard is always there. However, that this balance again about violent behaviour is not welcomed. And again, about protocols, this speaks to clearly defined boundaries around levels of intoxication within the framework of a no wrong door approach. It's important that boundaries are set prior to the establishment of the model. What's really interesting as well here is that there was a very powerful kind of comment around this idea of boundaries and protocols and procedures. Someone suggested that what is really important here is that the values and principles of the safe space and the approach, this non-clinical compassion-focused approach, is what needs to be communicated rather than a set of rules. And so people that are a guest can then have, that's clearly and transparently communicated, and then they will know what the expectations are. And then just someone saying, if behaviour allows them to effectively engage with the safe space service, then accessing other services shouldn't be a barrier. Again, find ways to balance the mix of guests in terms of age, sex, gender and ethnicity. Thanks, Tina. So the third scenario is that Amanda is a 20-year-old woman with a history of past suicide attempts who comes to the safe space extremely distressed. She says that her life is not worth living. She's tried everything to stop feeling this way. She tells the SP peer worker that she has been on dozens of different medications, tried therapy for childhood trauma, done everything the psychologist told her. She says nothing ever works and she's run out of options. When the worker asks if she has plans to kill herself, she tells them that she has the means and is just waiting for her mum and dad to leave her alone. Her history of previous attempts is known to one of the safe space peer workers who had previously supported her in the local ED. Thanks, Tina. So there was really great, meaningful conversation around how to respond to a scenario that's obviously quite complex. It's getting at the pointy end of the capacity to provide support. A lot of people said, and that it pushed up against people's risk tolerance, actually. But people were really in the room, really trying hard to work out how do we meaningfully work with someone in alignment with those values and principles, in alignment with the ministry's requirements for this service. So clear guidance need to be generated on how people engage with highly distressed people. So again, it's that idea of making sure there are clear guidelines, clear protocols and procedures. A person-centered approach delivered by a peer worker is so important. So that idea, regardless of the scenario, how potentially complex it may seem, that still needs to hold to that core value. Letting the guest be heard and waiting for the right time to ask specific questions. So building that rapport and the relationship of trust. Some tensions were around the concept actually of suicide prevention and the practicalities of whether someone will leave and harm themselves. So discussion around the fact that in traditional services, that's also a risk, that it's not about reducing a risk to zero, that's not a reasonable thing, as much as everyone's wishing for a suicide prevention service to be able to provide that, but to understand that it's about working to support people in the most meaningful way within the limits of what can be done. No assessment, someone said, is problematic, as opposed to having a high level of experience where decisions can be effectively made. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Tina, but I think that speaks to the fact that someone was saying quite rightly, we assess people, we make assessments all the time. That is a human thing. We make judgments and we use our powers of discrimination and judgment. And so that assessment is more, I guess, the idea is about the idea of the important thing here is having a level of experience and expertise where effective decisions can be made, rather than a focus on traditional clinical assessment. And again, here, someone saying we can't predict what someone is going to do post leaving the safe space, there'll always be risks present. So just speaking to that idea that suicide prevention is not the same, the idea of providing a suicide prevention service is not the same as saying that the service will be able to guarantee that no one will die by suicide. And then protocols need to be established around whether you need to notify family around intention to self-harm or suicide attempt. So that's speaking to that scenario where the person has indicated that the parents are her parents are in the picture, and so is there protocols around sort of taking that collaborative approach? Where do the need to respect the guest's wishes and balancing that out with risk? And then also talking about using a CAMS care model of assessment, or a tool that's already being used, health professionals said successfully, and they're actually, people are being trained in that way in the actual ED and hospital system, in the health system, a formal assessment, but collaborative tool as a way to understand someone else's needs. So it is a tool that has that person-centered approach. And then there are points of tension when Amanda declines support and isn't interested. So that idea of, while working with Amanda, if there is a point at which she declines support, then it's really about, that conversation was around what happens then. So again, that idea of needing well-described protocols for SP peer workers. And then someone just saying, well, Amanda is still at the safe space, so she wants to seek some form of support. So in this scenario, identifying that actually, in fact, Amanda has actually taken the step of coming to the safe space and really acknowledging and validating that, and that because of that, the peer work staff have the opportunity to continue to build rapport with her. Also about improving access to literacy and information to manage someone's own thoughts, emotions and well-being. So that idea of building capacity for self-management in the traditional clinical way of describing that. And then the response needs to be tailored to the individual. A cookie cutter response won't be appropriate. So recognising, speaking to that earlier point about people having experience of being able to work effectively, that idea that SP peer workers would have the ability to work in that very individual way and not just provide a generic response. It's also, someone said, it potentially unfair on the peer worker to be left with the decision to let someone leave or go home. So we had the good fortune of having a peer worker in this conversation, and they talked about their own professional experience as well, and that was a very powerful contribution to the conversation around what that is like. And so really a really great conversation between people with lived experience and professionals about that idea of the responsibility and the burden of responsibility, and the need for peer workers to be provided with good ongoing support for it to be a sustainable line of work for them, and concerns around duty of care and where this kind of situation sits within it. So again, that idea, I mean, that's a traditional idea of that's bedded into the protocols and procedures and policies of the health system, duty of care. So it's like, what would that look like in this context? And then thought should be given around how the safe space can link to other services with higher capability to deal with someone who is acutely unwell. So again, that idea that there may be limits to what the safe space can provide and what the scope of a SP peer worker is in terms of their practice. Thanks, Tina. And then we got people to just say, what are your nominated non-negotiables? What are the list we can feedback to the LHC about what you think, that regardless of even limitations in resourcing, all of those things, what are the things that are key? What are the kind of magic ingredients that are going to make this safe space one that works for your local community? And that is, people have choices and are able to select what would help them most while in distress. Safe space is consumer driven and meets the needs of the community. Having somewhere people can walk away from having a positive experience and are happy to re-engage. Having a place to access where people aren't judged and they're able to share their story, linking with support from other people who have experienced the same thing. So that idea of the value of peer work, that meaningful shared experience, making something not the same as other responses in the community. So just a recognition of this is a genuine alternative. Guidelines, boundaries and protocols are established prior to getting up and running. So again, you know, as we've already shared with you, really strong conversation and suggestions around the need for that and the importance of that. And so that's been highlighted as a non-negotiable. Links between peer workers and clinicians with pathways and relationships established before opening. So really understanding that it's super important to be responsive to that rather than reactive once the service is set up. Support for the peer workers, as I've said before, that came out strongly. Duty of care to participants and staff alike. And then again, just a final point that really was emphasised both by people with lived experience and health professionals. People need to be able to access empathetic support the safe space is all about meeting the needs of the local community, which is a nice way to wrap up our discussion here, our presentation of what happened in the final session. I have to say it was an incredibly rich and productive session. The participants throughout this process have really shown their commitment to contributing, which has been, you know, it's really enriched the process, and I hope people can see that through some of the stuff that's come out. Thanks, Tina. I'll hand back to you.
So where to from here? So the really important thing is that you encourage people to watch this webinar, and that you encourage as many people as possible to get involved in the final survey we have for Wagga for this co-design process. So the survey for Feedback Loop 3, it's available now. It'll close on the 14th of December. And you can see on the screen there that the link is there, but you can also access that link through the Roses in the Ocean website. And we'd like to hear as many perspectives as possible. So what we're looking to get is feedback on the things that we talked about in this webinar, and also some broader feedback. And all of that feedback will be gathered over the coming weeks, and it'll be put together and it'll be captured in a report. So that report will then be involved in developing a service model for the safe space in the Wagga area. And it will also provide some information to allow the finalisation of conversations about things like governance, location, and also for the LHD will be able to go ahead with staff recruitment, and the safe space will be up and running as soon as possible. The guardianship role of Roses in the Ocean will be to support the transfer of the service model to actual service delivery. And then in 3 to 6 months' time, after the new safe space is opened, there'll be what we call a redesign session. And that will involve all the people with lived experience and the health professionals that have been involved in this co-design process. And it will also bring people who have been guests of the safe space since it's been opened, and bring all of those people together to look at what needs to be maybe reconsidered, what's working, what could be made even better in terms of the way that the safe space is operating for people in Wagga. So, Carrie, is there anything that you would like to add to that?
No, just that I know there's a few people watching this live. If anyone's got any burning questions, hopefully, if you still had stuff to say, that you'll, we obviously encourage you, as Tina said, to have your say via the survey. But if there's anything that you're wanting to ask us now, feel free to do that. Just give people a couple of moments. I guess what I would say, just reiterate what I was saying before about how this process really showed the passion and the commitment of local co-design participants and other people that have given feedback through the surveys of to improve support for people in suicidal crisis. And I thought it was, you know, a fantastic opportunity that people took to really have their voices heard.
Yeah. So just giving you another couple of moments, if anyone who is joining us live has a question that they'd like to ask, you can use either the chat function or the Q&A function that you've got on your Zoom screen. And you're also welcome to ask questions directly to Roses in the Ocean. So you can contact us, and you can also contact us and provide us your perspectives, your feedback. I guess the most important things we want to come out of this webinar. Firstly, please spread the word. Please make sure that people who are in Wagga know about this survey, and encourage people to participate in it, because it's fantastic if we can get as broad a range of perspectives as possible. But the other thing that is almost even more important is we really genuinely want to thank everyone who has been involved in this co-design process in Wagga. So both people with lived experience and health professionals have been so generous with their time and so generous with their perspectives, often sharing experiences that are not easy to recollect, that can be quite difficult to talk about. And people have just been incredible in bringing those ideas and perspectives forward. And it's also been great to see the combined session and seeing those different perspectives come together and work together so well. So massive thank you to the people who have been involved in this co-design process in Wagga. So Carrie and I might sign off now. So thank you. And yeah, hope you have a good evening.